Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the second part of the elemental reaction guide. So in the first video, we very quickly talked about each reaction and the basic way that they function. In this video, we're basically going to be going a bit more in details on the reactions. We're going to be covering a few interactions between the reactions, but this video is going to be focused on all the reactions that are not dendro related, and the next video is going to be focusing on the dendro reactions. So let's get right into it. First off is Superconduct, which I decided to put first because it's probably the most simple one. Its damage isn't really high enough to ever justify building for Superconduct damage, so its only real utility is the debuff that it has. So when you trigger Superconduct, you reduce enemy physical resistance by 40%, which obviously increases your physical damage. In order to be able to tell how much damage you actually gain from Superconduct, we need to understand how resistance works. So every enemy has two forms of defensive stats. They have defense and they have resistance, and both of those stats will basically decrease the amount of damage you do. Defense is a stat that is shared between all the enemies, but that is decided by their and your level. If you're high level and the enemy is high level, they'll have a certain amount of defense that will reduce your damage by a certain amount. But if you start out leveling them, it won't reduce it by as much. And if the enemy is heavily over leveled, it will reduce it by even more. Superconduct doesn't actually affect defense. What it affects is resistance. So resistance is a thing that enemies have based on their enemy type, and that they will keep whether they're level 1 or level 100. You'll have a specific resistance to each element and resistance to physical. Now, the baseline assumption that most enemies have is they have 10% resistance to everything. But specific enemies have either more or less resistance to specific elements or to physical. The way that the resistance formula works is if the enemy has 10% physical resistance, then they'll take 10% less physical damage, which is pretty straightforward. But if they have below 0 in their resistances, if they have, for example, minus 10% physical resistance, they're not actually taking 10% more, they're only taking 5% more. So when it's below 0, the effectiveness is basically divided by 2. Where you can really gain the most value out of reducing enemy resistance is if they have really high resistance to begin with. So for example, Ruin Guards have 70% physical resistance at a baseline, which means you do 70% less damage, which is 30% outgoing damage. 30% of your damage actually hits the enemy. Superconduct reduces that 70% all the way down to 30 because it reduces it by 40%, which means that instead of doing 30%, you're doing 70%. So effectively, you're more than doubling your damage against Ruin Guards by triggering Superconduct. So in situations like against Ruin Guards, Superconduct is incredibly valuable. But if you're already fighting enemies that have low physical resistance, for example, they have minus 20% physical resistance. It's divided by 2, so you only deal 10% more damage. You deal 110% of the damage that you would usually do. And then when you reduce the resistance by 40, it goes to minus 60, but that only increases your damage by 30%. So you go from 110% to 130%, which is a very, very minor increase compared to what happens on a Ruin Guard. It's still an increase, it's still a useful increase, but it's not nearly as useful. So all of this to say that Superconduct's value heavily depends on what kind of enemy you're fighting. Sometimes without Superconduct, you'll feel like you're not doing anything, and sometimes Superconduct is just a small damage buff. Because people just view resistance shred as this incredibly valuable thing, which generally it is, this leads people to think that you always have to run Superconduct when you're playing a physical team. But there are definitely situations when, because the enemy's resistance is so low to begin with, Superconduct's value isn't as high, and you'd potentially be better off running a different element just to get more damage or more battery on your character. Superconduct is still always going to be useful, but there are definitely situations where its value is not as high as usual. The main thing to remember for when Superconduct will have value is that, as a general rule, humanoid enemies, so enemies that look like humans or human-type bodies, those enemies almost always start with minus 20% resistance, which means that Superconduct isn't all that valuable against them. Whereas Ruin enemies, like Ruin Guards, Ruin Graders, generally have anywhere between 30 and 70% physical resistance, which means that Superconduct is incredibly valuable against those enemies. Let's move on to Overloaded. Overloaded's base damage is a lot higher than Superconduct, and when you just look at the damage from Overloaded, you'd think that it's a pretty solid reaction. But it still wouldn't be enough to, like, by itself be able to carry a team. But then on top of that, Overloaded knocks enemies away. And if you're relatively new to Genshin, you might think that that's an upside, but the biggest issue with it is that in Genshin, all of our, like, quote-unquote difficult content, or all of our quote-unquote endgame content, is based on a time limit, and you just have to kill enemies within that time limit. And when you're fighting a group of enemies, triggering Overloaded will knock them away from you, but then on top of that, it will knock them away from each other, which can significantly slow down your clear times. It can make it so that instead of hitting all the enemies at once, you're only hitting them one at a time, which is a pretty massive downside. However, that doesn't mean that Overloaded is just completely useless. It still has some value, some of which we'll be covering a little bit later on. But the main thing to remember is that it still does have pretty high damage. So when you're fighting, for example, single target enemies, or enemies that are immune to crowd control, immune to getting knocked back, you look at rune guards, you look at bosses most of the time, then those enemies, you don't have the downside from Overloaded, so all you get is the upside of the damage it does. And then on top of that, there's a lot of Electro and Pyro units that just work well together because their kits just function well together, which means that you have an incentive to run Overloaded, even if it's not just for the reaction itself. Next up is Electro-Charged. And Electro-Charged is a little bit more complicated than the previous reactions. It has a special interaction that makes it work differently from the other reactions. So, as we covered in the first video, you generally have an aura and a trigger. You apply an aura to an enemy by applying an element, and then the next time you apply a different element, it'll trigger a reaction and potentially remove that aura. With Electro-Charged, it's not exactly how it works. The way that Electro-Charged works is when you apply Hydro and Electro, they both become the aura. And they're both going to be the aura for a pretty short duration, during which the enemies will take damage over time. Or they'll take Electro-Charged damage when you trigger the reaction, and then every second until they're out of aura. If there's more Hydro than Electro, well, it'll take down the Electro and you'll have some Hydro left, and then the other way around is also true. The thing about that is because they can both coexist and they have a timer at which it ticks, then if you're applying Electro on an enemy that's already Electro-Charged, it's not necessarily going to trigger Electro-Charge. Because if you're also applying Hydro afterwards, before the Electro-Charge timer goes through, right, before the 1 second has passed, who triggers the reaction? Who gets the ownership of the Electro-Charge damage? And the answer to that is whoever applied it last. But because it's pretty hard to tell who's applying it last, because you'll generally have, like, for example, you have Fischl, you have Xingqiu, you have Beidou all in the team at the same time, it's pretty hard to tell who's going to be applying it last before each tick of Electro-Charge, so it becomes a lot more difficult to understand which character is triggering Electro-Charge. And very often, it's not just that it's difficult to understand, it's that when you do understand it, sometimes it's one character and sometimes it's the other. And because of that, well, do you really want to build full elemental mastery on a character that only triggers Electro-Charge every once in a while? Not really. But all of your characters are triggering Electro-Charge every once in a while, which leads to a situation where it's not really worth going for full elemental mastery on characters that trigger Electro-Charge generally. There is a situation where characters that trigger Electro-Charge can be built with elemental mastery, and we will be covering that later on in the video. Now, just listening to what I've said so far, you might think that that double aura thing is a downside, because it means that you can't really reliably make sure that it's always the same character triggering the reaction. But there's also a massive upside to it. And the massive upside is you have two auras on an enemy. So what happens when you apply a third element? Well, it can actually potentially trigger two reactions at the same time. If you're applying Pyro on an Electro-Charged enemy, it can react with Electro and with Hydro. So your Pyro attack can both overload and vaporize. You can also do the same thing with Anemo, where you can apply Anemo on an Electro-Charged enemy, and it can potentially trigger a Hydro and an Electro Swirl. But we'll be covering that more in the Swirl section later on. The Pyro interaction is what allows one of the most popular teams in the game, which is the Raiden National or Rational team, to work as well as it does. The Raiden National team, or the Rational team, has been incredibly popular since basically Raiden's release, because it's a team that's overall very strong and is definitely up there with other good meta teams, but it's not like significantly stronger or the only good team that you can play at all. It's not even close to it. So why is it so popular? Well, the main reason why it's so popular is because it's really easy to play. Because instead of having to worry about making sure that you swirl the right element and that you get your Viridescent Venom set and buff uptime and all that bullshit, you basically just cast all of your bursts and then go on Raiden and then attack. That's one of the upsides of using Electro-Charge as an aura for Pyro, so of triggering Overload and Vape at the same time, is that generally you can actually build teams around that don't use Anemo units, which makes them inherently a lot easier to play. Because Xingqiu's Hydro application is so fast, adding an Electro unit on your team, sure, you're going to weaken your aura a little bit by triggering Electro-Charge, but you're still able to have your Xiangling vaporize almost every hit of her Pyronado, and then on top of that, she also gets Overload with almost every hit of her Pyronado, which ends up being a pretty significant of damage that you gain from those overloads. The interaction that lets you trigger Overload and Vaporize with the same attack is generally referred to as Over-Vape, which is pretty straightforward. Overload and Vaporize. Over-Vape. So this Over-Vape interaction is pretty valuable, and it's one of the main reasons why Electro-Charge is so good, because it wouldn't be possible if Electro-Charge didn't work the way that it does. But because your Pyro unit ends up being able to trigger both Vaporize and Overloaded at once, then you really are incentivized to build a pretty good amount of Elemental Mastery, because you're getting two different sources of damage that care about Elemental Mastery. Next up, let's talk about Vaporize. So Vaporize is the first of the multiplicative reactions that we're going to talk about. If you're not sure what a multiplicative reaction is, you can go check out the previous video, but as a very TLDR refresher, multiplicative reactions have a strong side and a weak side. When you trigger a strong side multiplicative reaction, you multiply your damage by 2, and when you trigger the weak side, you multiply it by 1.5. In the case of Vaporize, the strong side is Hydro on Pyro, and the weak side is Pyro on Hydro. Strong side reactions are also called forward, and weak side reactions are also called reverse. So Pyro on Hydro would be reverse Vaporize, and Hydro on Pyro would be forward Vaporize. However, the thing that we didn't really explain in the previous video, we touched on it a little bit, just said it was going to be a thing in this video, is that it doesn't just influence the multiplier. We're not going to be explaining exactly everything about elemental gauge and elemental gauge theory. That's going to be kept for the fourth video, which is on the theory crafting concept. But the important part for this video is that effectively, you don't always remove all of the aura when you trigger a reaction. Sometimes you'll remove less aura, and sometimes you'll remove more aura. When you do forward Vaporize, you're almost guaranteed to remove all the aura. But when you're doing reverse Vaporize, you're only removing a pretty small amount of the aura. Which means that when you use a Pyro character against an enemy that's affected with Hydro, you can actually reliably get more than one of your attacks vaporized. Which means that you don't need too much Hydro application to be able to keep up with your Pyro if you want your Pyro to be the one to vaporize. But if it were to be the other way around, you would need an incredibly high amount of Pyro application to make sure that your Hydro character is always the one to vaporize. Just like Vaporize, Melt also has a forward and a reverse side, and the forward side for Melt is Pyro on Cryo, which means that generally, when you have a Pyro carry, it's going to be really difficult to get them to forward melt consistently, because you would need an incredibly high amount of Cryo application to be able to keep up with your Pyro carry. Whereas it's very easy to do with a Hydro support and to just reverse Vaporize instead. When you play Pyro units in Over-Vape, you're kind of taking advantage of both of the interactions, the Hydro and Electro coexisting interaction and the reverse side interaction, to basically make sure that you're not actually stealing any of your Vaporize procs from your Xiangling by putting Raiden or another Electro unit on your team. One thing that's important to know about your Pyro units in Vaporize versus in Over-Vape is that in general for Vaporize, you'll want crit, you'll want attack, and you'll want EM, and you'll want power damage or other sources of damage percent, like burst damage, stuff like that. But because it's pretty easy to get a lot of external buffs for attack and EM, and because the percentage gains that you get from getting more EM when you already have a lot becomes lower, same for attack, it's generally recommended to focus mainly on crit, without ignoring obviously attack and EM, but to try to go for crit a bit more than attack and EM. In Over-Vape though, because you're also getting overloads, which can't crit and don't get affected with damage percent and don't scale with attack, you actually get a bit more value out of EM, which means that the threshold at which EM starts not becoming valuable is a lot higher, and you can basically just go for a lot of EM still. You still don't want to go, for example, triple EM main stats on your Sands, Goblet, and Circlet, but you're basically always going to want an EM Sands at the very least. And in some situations, not most, but some situations, you can also consider an Elemental Mastery Circlet. We've already mentioned a little bit about Melt, but let's explore that a little bit more. So unlike Hydro, Pyro doesn't really have the ability to coexist with another aura. Technically, it can coexist with Dendro because when you're triggering Burning, there's still some Dendro left on the enemy until it burns away. but because Cryo doesn't have an interaction with Dendro, then that doesn't really matter in this case, and we'll be covering a little bit more about that in the burning section in the next video. Because it doesn't have that possibility of coexisting with another element, then it doesn't have as much versatility as Vaporize does. So, like we said earlier, it has a strong side and a weak side, the strong side being Pyro and Cryo, and the weak side is Cryo on Pyro, which means it's a lot easier to trigger a lot of reverse melts with your Cryo unit than forward melts with your Pyro unit. Which means that most of the melt teams that we see focus on a Cryo unit being the one to melt rather than a Pyro unit. However, there is an interesting mechanic with Cryo that can actually potentially let you forward melt with Pyro units. When you trigger Frozen on an enemy, and while the enemy's frozen, the game effectively treats that freeze as a Cryo aura, which means that you can potentially use freeze to melt an attack. And so if you have really fast Hydro application and a little bit of Cryo, then you can potentially get a nice mix of forward melt and reverse vapes with your Pyro carry. Basically, you gain a little bit of damage out of some of your elemental application attacks, triggering melt instead of Vaporize. And because of the Hydro, you're still kind of preventing your Pyro unit from becoming an aura. So let's explain that a little bit more. Frozen is a pretty interesting reaction. It applies a frozen aura, which isn't exactly a Cryo aura, but in most cases behaves like one. And while the enemy has a frozen aura on them, they're frozen, so they can't move, and you can potentially trigger a sub-reaction, which is Shatter. I've given a pretty surface level explanation of what a sub-reaction is in the previous video. Certain reactions can't be triggered with element on element. They have to be triggered with element on reaction. So you need to first trigger a reaction to then get the second reaction. And that's what I mean by sub-reactions. So when enemies are frozen, you can trigger Shatter by attacking the enemies with blunt attacks. Blunt attacks are a little bit vague in the game. There's not really a clear indicator of whether or not an attack is blunt and can shatter. A good way to generally be able to tell if an attack is blunt or not if it feels like it's a heavy attack. But that's incredibly vague still, so generally you're just better off asking or looking up whether an attack is blunt or not if you want to know. But the main use of freeze is effectively just to try to keep the enemies permanently frozen, or frozen for as long as possible. Triggering Shatter removes frozen, which means that generally you just want to avoid it. So you want to stick to attacks that aren't blunt in your freeze teams. The reason why frozen is so good is because it prevents the enemies from attacking you, but also prevents them from getting staggered and from getting knocked back. So that means that you can use some attacks that would usually knock enemies back, and then instead of knocking them back, they're going to stay frozen and they're going to stay together. But then on top of that, when you pair frozen with a bunch of the animal units that can group enemies, and then you freeze them together, or you can effectively clear your chambers significantly faster because you can attack all the enemies at once instead of one at a time or two at a time. There's some units that are actually designed around that and that are pretty bad without it. So if you look at Ganyu, for example, she has some melt teams that focus on her charge attacks, but outside of melt teams, she also has freeze teams. And in freeze teams, what really makes her good is that her burst has a pseudo-quadratic scaling. Basically, the more enemies there are together, the more damage your burst does. Because each icicle homes into an enemy, but if there's only one enemy, you'll only get one icicle, and then there's a bunch that fall in other places, and then one icicle, and then a bunch. So you get a total of about 10. But if there's two enemies, if they're not close together, the first enemy gets 10 and the second enemy gets 10. But then if they are close together, and they're both there, then the first 10 fall on both of them, and then the second 10 also fall on both of them. So you get 20, and each of those 20 is hitting both. Attacks like Ganyu's Burst have quadratic scaling. So if you get one enemy, you have one number, but if you get two enemies, you have 4 numbers. Then 3 enemies, you have 9 numbers. Technically, Ganyu's Burst has a cap of 5 because the way that the icicles work is decided in waves of 5. But the point being, keeping enemies stuck together for Ganyu's Burst is incredibly valuable. Her damage on each enemy gets multiplied by however many enemies are there when you're in AoE. But even if your units don't have quadratic scaling, or pseudo-quadratic scaling, they can still rely on freeze pretty heavily. For example, let's look at Ayaka. Ayaka's Burst has really high scaling, but it staggers the enemies a lot, which means that if the enemies are not too heavy, they're just gonna get knocked away. And it's not just one hit, it's a bunch of hits over a medium-ish duration, which means that if the enemies move, then they don't take the damage. So if you can actually freeze the enemies and you can keep the enemies frozen, frozen, you can actually get all of the 20 hits from Ayaka to hit the enemy, which is incredibly valuable. If you don't get that, Ayaka becomes a lot worse. Even outside of those two units, being able to freeze enemies saves you the trouble of having to manipulate AI to keep them grouped and having to catch up with enemies that manage to evade you anyways. The reality with freeze is that when you're against enemies that can be frozen, freeze is generally one of, if not the best reaction in the game, because effectively making it so that your AoE hits all the enemies is just so incredibly valuable. And keeping enemies in place so they don't run away is also incredibly valuable. But freeze is still kept in check and kept away from just being the best thing in the game by some enemies being immune to frozen. So you look at a lot of the bosses and then a few non-boss enemies that have specific mechanics that can't actually be frozen. And when you're against those bosses, then freeze is just pretty bad. Not only do you not get the ability to keep them in place, but also the scent bonus for freeze units, which is the Porpoise Blizzard Trigger that gives you 40% crit rate against frozen enemies, doesn't work if the enemies aren't frozen. And so freeze is kind of being kept in check by the existence of unfreezable enemies. But when you're against freezable enemies, it is incredibly strong. Next up, we have Crystallize. If we don't count Shatter because it's a sub-reaction, Crystallize is effectively the worst reaction in the game. It generates a shard when you trigger it, and you can pick up the shard for a shield. And then that shard gives you a shield based on your character's elemental mastery and level. But because we don't have any Geo characters that scale with elemental mastery within their kit, you're effectively forced to choose between building EM and getting a shield from a Crystallize, or building the stat that your character scales with and have that character actually do something. Even the defensive Geo characters, for example Zhongli, you'd rather build him with HP than build him with EM. There's kind of not that much of a use for Crystallize. It does have a bit of use when it comes to defensive options if you know that you're fighting an elemental infused enemy, like for example when you're fighting Oceanid like spawns, because they're always affected with Hydro and they only deal Hydro damage to you, which means that to some extent your shields can actually have a little bit of value because Crystallize shields protect more against the element that was used to trigger Crystallize, right? The main use for Crystallize is that it's something that you can use to trigger the Archaic Petra set. So the Archaic Petra is the Geo set bonus that has the effect of giving you a damage bonus when you pick up a Crystallized shard. In order to actually get that damage bonus, you need to pick up the Crystallized shard with your character that has Archaic Petra. Otherwise, you just don't get it. And it gives you a damage bonus to the element that reacted with Geo for Crystallize. It can also basically be what gets your Geo Resonance going, because in order to get the Geo Resonance stuff, you have to be protected by a shield, which means that getting the crystal gives you a shield, so you don't have to put a shielder on your team. Unfortunately, there isn't much else to say about Crystallize. It's not really anything that I haven't talked about in my other videos, so I kind of feel bad not having much else to say, but Crystallize is kind of just not very good. Another thing that was mentioned in the previous video is that Geo can't be applied as an aura, which means that at the very least, when you put a Geo character on your team, it won't always fuck over your reactions. Or the way that Crystallize works with auras is it kind of works like a reverse reaction in the sense that it doesn't take away too much of your aura. So if you're not applying too much Geo, you can put a Geo character on your team without it messing with the reactions you want to be triggering. But if you start putting two Geo characters, then that can actually be a little bit of a problem. The last reaction we'll be talking about in this video is Swirl, which is arguably the most complicated one of the reactions, and also arguably one of the better ones. When you apply Animo to either Electro, Pyro, Cryo, or Hydro, you get Swirl, and Swirl isn't just damage, it also applies whatever element you swirled to nearby enemies. So if you're triggering Swirl on Pyro, it'll deal Pyro damage to the enemies around and to the main target, and it will apply Pyro to the enemies around, which can actually be incredibly valuable. Hydro Swirl doesn't work exactly the same way as the other swirls, because it still spreads the element, it still applies Hydro to enemies around, but it doesn't actually do AoE damage. It only does damage to the main target, which is a little bit unfortunate, but it's not the end of the world. We talked a little bit about quadratic scaling and how when you have multiple enemies, they all take 1 instance damage for each enemy when you have an ability that has quadratic scaling, like Ganyu's Burst. Swirl actually has almost quadratic scaling in the sense that when you're at one enemy, you'll get 1 instance of damage, and when you're at 2 enemies, it actually works like quadratic. You'll get 2 instances of swirl damage for each enemy. So each enemy is going to take 2 instances of swirl damage. But it is capped out at 2, which means that when you have 3 enemies, it's still 2 each for a total of 6 instead of a total of 9 if it was 3 each. That property of being up to 2 enemies quadratic scaling is actually shared with Superconduct, but I haven't mentioned it in Superconduct because Superconduct doesn't do enough damage for it to really be worth talking about. The main value in Swirl, like sure, the damage is okay, but the main value for Swirl is twofold. So the first real useful application for Swirl is that because it applies an element, well, that elemental application can trigger another reaction. So you can get chain reactions out of a Swirl. But then on top of that, Anemo has access to the Viridescent Venerer artifact set, which reduces enemies' elemental resistances to whatever element you swirled by 40%. So effectively, Superconduct, but for elemental damage. And because there's a lot more elemental teams than physical teams, we just have a lot more elemental carries than physical carries, then that property of Viridescent Venerer, of Swirl, is incredibly valuable. And then what makes these two properties so incredibly valuable is that, just like Geo, Anemo doesn't actually have the ability to be applied as an aura, generally. Which means that your Anemo character cannot be aura for Swirl. They will always be the trigger. So you can put them on Viridescent Venerer, and you can build them for Elemental Mastery, and every reaction, every Swirl reaction, and every chain reaction caused by Swirl is going to be caused by your Anemo character. Because of this, Anemo characters, at least the ones that focus on Swirl, heavily want to be leveled up all the way to 90, and to be given a lot of Elemental Mastery. Sometimes you're going to need a specific amount of ER, of energy recharge, to get your burst back when you need it, but other than energy recharge, the main stat you're looking for is Elemental Mastery. There's also some situations where you want to put specific Anemo characters on a Favonius weapon, in which case you'd want enough crit rate to trigger the Favonius weapon passive, but really, as a general rule, it's mainly EM that you're looking for. I won't get into too much detail on what chain reactions you can trigger with Swirl, but I will use an example that is actually incredibly strong and very often underrated by people who aren't that interested in theory crafting. So taser teams basically describe the teams that have Electro-Charge on the enemy. So you have Electro and Hydro characters to trigger Electro-Charge, and then you have an Animal character to trigger Swirl, so Hydro Swirl and Electro Swirl, and hopefully, by spreading Hydro and Electro to nearby enemies, Electro-Charge. So you can have your Animal character trigger Electro-Charge as a chain reaction. And because they want to be built with full Elemental Mastery to begin with most of the time, then you get that Elemental Mastery to also affect your Electro-Charge damage that your Animal characters are dealing. What makes taser teams so good is the fact that they get all of those reactions on your Animal characters, but then on top of that, you're still triggering Viridescent Venerer, which means that your Hydro and Electro characters are doing a lot more damage. And then a bunch of the Animal characters also have other sources of buffs. So for example, Sucrose shares Elemental Mastery with her whole team. So while you generally don't want to build Elemental Mastery specifically on your Electro and Hydro characters for Electro-Charge, they'll still have some amount of Electro-Charge ownership, which means that giving them EM is still valuable. Then Kazuha gives a pretty nice amount of damage bonus based on his Elemental Mastery to your Hydro and Electro characters because you're triggering swirls for both. And then Venti can refund energy for either your Hydro or your Electro characters. You basically have a lot of ways to have your Animal characters, on top of just being the one to trigger chain reactions, also help the rest of your team to deal more damage. So that does it for the second video. I hope you learned a thing or two. The third video is going to be covering, in around the same amount of depth, the Dendro-related reactions. If you haven't been following leaks, you'll definitely be able to learn a thing or two there. And then the fourth video will approach specific concepts that we've talked about and really go more in depth into it.